What's going on, guys? So this is a video log number 5. I know that I've only briefly touched on 2JZ stuff in my previous video logs, and I figure there's people out there that like watching video logs, and I want to give an update of everything that some stuff that I've added to the block since I put my last video up on assembling the block, and stuff that I'm working on right now with the head, and just where I'm at with that. I have the video mostly done with that. Things that I have going on with the body of the car. See, there's a box that has a new hood. Well, it's an empty box. I just put it on top of the car until I can cut it up and put it in the recycle bin. And then I have a new bumper going on. I'm going to talk about all that stuff, and then the things that I have to do to the car that's left, and the things that I'm still waiting on, really, which is only a few little things, well, a few big things, but I can't assemble the car until I get those things. I'm waiting drive shaft and cross member for the transmission for the T56. So I'm still waiting on that stuff. But if you want to click through and jump through any point in the video, I'll be using YouTube's chapter feature down below. So you can click on the progress bar and then jump to any one of those sections just to watch that section or rewatch that section. First things first, so with the block, so things that I've added to the block since I made the video on assembling the block. So I drilled and tapped this while it was on the engine because I meant to drill and tap it before. I just did it in a way, I taped over the hole that was already there for the oil drain, because I had that cheap turbo kit that was on the car, small turbo kit. I put this oil drain on to replace the 10AN fitting that they had tapped the oil pan and threaded the 10AN fitting straight into that. I wanted to have it more like this just to rule out any leaks and things like that. So I drilled and tapped these. These are M8, and they don't go all the way into the inside. So when I taped over and I drilled down, I think about that far, I was able to put these studs in that I got from that junk engine over there, little FJ Cruiser engine. Well, it's from a Tacoma, but it's the same engine that's in the FJ Cruisers. But get these studs from it. So this is a 10AN fitting. I'm not sure whether I'm going to use this 45-degree angle one or whether I'm going to use a straight 10AN fitting. I've got a few of those. I ordered this. I was actually looking at the Greddy oil filter relocation kit just because on the 2JZ it's just in such a difficult place to remove. And it might make it a little bit easier having the factory oil cooler on, because that will move it down a little more, but it's still probably going to be a little difficult to get to the filter to get that off. So I have a relocation kit that I can feed it down. It'll also give me a little more oil capacity too, because there'll be oil going through the 10AN lines, and it'll give me slightly more oil. So I have the 45-degree here. Just that helps out with the angle. I didn't want to use 90-degree angles in any part of the oil filter relocation kit just because it adds a little more resistance than the 45-degree bend does. So anyway, so this is a drift motion kit, and I got this because it's got this 10AN fitting straight on it. So I'm not using hose clamps and just a regular hose fitting that was on the bottom of the Greddy one. I couldn't find it with the 10AN, even though people had said that they found them with 10AN. I couldn't find any with 10AN on it. So I got this. It ended up being cheaper in the end than it would have been had I gotten the Greddy one. And this is drift motion. I think it looks a little bit better. That's a junk filter that I have on it just to keep it clean. So I plugged this hole with a sensor, and I put the 10AN fittings here, and then put these little whatever things in there so that it keeps dust out. That's the kind of filter that I'm going to be running on it. I'll be running the larger Tacoma FJ Cruiser filters. So 45-degree angle bends instead of the 90 degrees. And I might end up just using straight fittings here because of however it ends up being mounted. It's, yeah, definitely not using 90s coming off of this because it would be pumping up, but it would also be pumping up into a 90-degree, and I just don't want that. That's just losing oil pressure, and I don't really want to do that. Another little thing that I've added since I posted the video. So this is a 3/8 BSPT fitting that came on the GTE cars, so that all of the Supras, and I guess the Aristo also, they have this little hose fitting so that you can feed the coolant back into the block. And it's an 8mm hex head fitting. So I actually had to heat this up, so I burned my tape a little bit. So I had to heat this up to get that plug out. But Heated it up, got it out. And I'm still using this. If anybody is already typing a comment down below, like, you're building an 800 horsepower 2JZ, why are you still using the factory oil cooler? So my response to that is, I'm not going to be drag racing the car. If I were drag racing the car, like, I'm a very firm believer in, you build the car initially to what your expectations are, like how you're going to use it. Like, if I were drag racing the car, I would run a thermostatic plate with 10 AN lines going to an oil cooler. But I'm not going to be drag racing the car. It's just a high horsepower daily driver. Also, one of the things that would keep me from drag racing it is I have a front sump 2JZ. So if I had a rear sump, it would be more suitable for drag racing. So like between those two things, that they're not really related except that they both carry oil, but they're both things that would keep me from drag racing this engine. If I were to drag race it, I would probably consider getting a rear sump setup, getting a modified oil pump so that I could put a thicker oil in, because the thicker oil would keep my engine cooler, run a more open bearing clearance for the main bearings and the rod bearings, and even around the cams where they sit. So like the tolerances and all of that stuff would have to be slightly larger if I were running a thicker oil. I'm not drag racing the car. No need to run a thicker oil for the better cooling capabilities. So thicker oil would also be restricted here in the factory oil cooler. So yeah, that's a lot talking about that, but I feel like it's necessary information because it's good to plan those things in advance. Like, oh, I'm going to be drag racing the car. So yeah, I'm getting a rear sump, but I also should get a higher flow oil pump so that when I run thicker oil, it can flow that oil a little bit easier. And I should get rid of the restrictions for that thicker oil, which would be the factory specification bearing clearances for the main bearings and for the rod bearings, and the factory oil cooler, which would be even more of a restriction in that situation. I like the factory oil coolers. I actually bolted one of these into the FJ Cruiser that I pulled from a Tacoma that had a tow package. So along with that higher output alternator, because that came on the tow package for the Tacoma. So I've got those parts on the FJ Cruiser. So it essentially has a tow package now. But yeah, those are the things that I've done to the engine so far that I don't have in that build video. So that's that with the block. Moving on to the head. So things that I have that I've updated on the head. I'm in the middle of reshimming my valves. So I'm changing out to the shimless valve setup. And also this has been powder coated. Look at that. That crinkle, the crinkle black. That's just beautiful. This matches the turbo, which the turbo is Cerakote. Same thing, crinkle black, almost the same texture. Oh, the intake manifold here. So you can't really see it that well, but it's also that crinkle black. One of my previous video logs was, I talked about this, and it looks so ugly just with the black paint that was all over it, and it was very sticky to the touch. It was like the IS300 sticky dash that was the problem. Like when you touch it, it's just like you're peeling your hand off, and it's almost like it made that sound. It wouldn't really, but it felt like it made that sound. But yeah, so I had this powder coated, that crinkle black, whenever I had these powder coated crinkle black, and also the upper water neck that goes on top of the water pump. It goes here, and then it bolts into the side of the head. And this had crinkle black too. And then I think some really tiny bracket stuff, because I was just like, here, can you do these also? And then they just did those. But the little things they didn't even really charge me for. So that's that. But yeah, I'm really glad that Greddy intake manifold came out the way that it did. I paid $200 for that. Like it's just, and now with the way that it looks, because the guy that it was ugly, he had a Supra, but he didn't want that on the Supra, and I wouldn't either. I mean, it's the way that it was, yeah. But I think now if he could see it, he would probably wish that he would have kept it, because the cost of powder coating it, crinkle black, well, they sandblasted it and powder coated it, and then I paid $20 for the little Greddy logo that goes in, and it fits in that little rectangular slot. So that's cool. That's exciting. Again, I drilled out the baffles and then retapped those. So I have 10 millimeter and I was going back and forth on whether I should use red Loctite or blue Loctite, because I wanted to use Loctite. And then I was thinking, if I'm going to use Loctite, use the red stuff, because there's no reason for me to want to remove these baffles. If I ever have to remove the baffles in the future, it would probably be to have the valve covers powder coated again. In that situation, I would remove the bolts just by heating them up with a torch, melting the red Loctite, taking each one of those bolts out, and then that would probably also mess up the powder coat, but it doesn't matter because they would be getting powder coated again. I used red Loctite because I don't want those bolts falling out and wreaking havoc on the inside of the head, around the whole valve train, cam assembly, all that stuff. Speaking of, lifter buckets. These are shim over bucket. These are bad. Well, I mean, they're perfect in a stock setup. Whenever you run larger cams, it's best to update the buckets to change out from shim over bucket to shimless. And what's cool is, so this one is like a numbered 48 on it because that's what the number is on the inside. There. So 48. So yeah, so this one's labeled 48. But what I think a lot of people don't know is coming off the assembly line, because if you buy them online, those buckets they go up in increments of 2. So that one's a 48 because it's 5.48 millimeters thick. Right under that one is 4.7. So this one's 4.7 because, make sure it's not upside down. That number you can't see very well. 41, so it's another odd one. So if you look at it, that one's labeled 41. These you can only really get from a junkyard. And I've checked the tops of these. They're smooth, they're fine. They're not scratched at all. They just show like basic wear, but they're still smooth to the touch. So they're not gonna cut into my cams. But I like that because you can be a little more precise. And then, you know, so with my little spreadsheet that I have, which I don't have my laptop in here, but I basically modified a spreadsheet. I can measure things in thousandths of an inch. So I can measure the thickness of my old shims and the buckets. Add that thousandth of an inch measurement to the valve lash, measuring that between the buckets and the cam lobe, and then subtracting from my expected valve lash, which on this intake is 0.008 millimeters and 0.010 millimeters. Did I get that right? Yeah. The card is right there on the floor with a bunch of other trash stuff. I have been cleaning up trash in the garage, so it is a little bit cleaner than it was. So that way I could, it's like, okay, well, these are the two measurements. That's the bucket plus the current valve lash or valve clearance. And I just subtract those two measurements, those two numbers joined together, subtract the 0.008 for intake and 0.010 for exhaust, subtract those numbers from the total of those two. So I've been doing that along with trying to find buckets. I've texted a few people I'm out of buckets, shimless buckets now. So I'm gonna have to revisit the junkyard, and I'm on an island, so it's very limited. So I'm looking for certain cars that are being parted out on Facebook Marketplace so that I can go and pull the buckets out. Of those, that would be the GR family engines, the AZ family engines, ZZ family engines, and I think NZ in some of the Priuses, 2012 to 2015 Prius C. So yeah, so getting those buckets and trying to find the odd ones, because you can only get those in a junkyard because they came off the factory floor from Toyota Precision. That way I get odd buckets and I can have my valve lash even more precise and dialed in than just going up in increments of 2 millimeter. I think that's exciting. Stuff like that excites me. I think it's cool. I just like the precision of doing valve lash. Speaking of, slight change of, but still in the vein of valve lash, Gen 3 3SGTEs use shim-under bucket. What a lot of people don't know is, yeah, you can go shimless, and it's probably easier to go shimless buckets with those, but if you're re-shimming the engine, you can actually use the Kawasaki 13 millimeter shims because they're the right thickness, and they're for a motorcycle, but they actually fit in the bottom of the 3rd Gen 3SGTE shim-under bucket that has the shims on the bottom side of the bucket. So if someone were to have a whole set of those, like, well, what do I do with these? I want to use these to re-shim my 2JZ. Well, hey, you can use those, just get the Kawasaki 13 millimeter shim that go in the Kawasaki motorcycle, but in this situation you're using it for the 3rd gen 3S GTE buckets that are shim under, but in the 2JZ. They're all 31 millimeter diameter buckets, so they all work, whether they're shimless, shim under bucket, or shim over bucket. And I've thought about going to shim under bucket, but shimless does gives me a lighter valve train. It might be a little hard to find shim under bucket buckets anyway, just because they weren't in a ton of Toyotas. It's mostly shim over bucket, and now shimless, and then the newer stuff is going to rockers, it looks like. But back to the head. So I pressed the radium fittings in. This, I just decided I would change this up. So I put little studs here, also from that Tacoma engine that has the sludge in it. So I took these studs and I put these in because the threads were kind of damaged on this a little bit. So I cleaned up the threads with my tap tool, with my thread tap, the M6 tap, but I didn't feel comfortable running a bolt. I didn't want to, especially with the angle that I would be putting the bolt in here while it's on the car. I don't like that, and I didn't want to risk damaging the threads again, so I figure I'll put a stud there, and it's short. It's just the right height to where I can tighten this and torque it down, and the stud doesn't protrude that much. That's cool. I like that. So I shouldn't have any issues with this thread anymore. Hopefully it'll accept the torque and the thread wasn't damaged too much, but if it does get damaged, then I guess I'll fix that as I get to it. What else? The exhaust manifold that I have. So this is a cheap eBay exhaust manifold. I think it was like $400 or something like that. It's nice. I like it. It's stainless steel. It's a very thick stainless steel, but 3 of the holes didn't line up, so I had to take 3 of the studs off. And I talked to a buddy of mine that does a lot of metal work, and I asked him, like, hey, what do I do with this? I want to expand some of the holes out, but this is 1/2 inch thick stainless steel. So yeah, I was just basically asking him, like, what do I do with that? And how do I mean, I can't just take a Dremel to it, or what I like doing is just taking a drill bit and using the side of it to cut into something, but that's not going to work very well at all on stainless steel, especially if it's 1/2 inch thick. So trying to figure out what I'm going to do with that. But yeah, so that I'm still going to get the titanium studs, that titanium exhaust studs. I like the titanium ones because I don't have to worry about them rusting and stripping out, just because like the threads of those will stay in good shape under high heat, and especially since I'm about a mile from the beach as the bird flies. Yeah, so head's coming together. I just have to address the issue with the exhaust manifold, but that's, I mean, I can assemble the engine with that being as it is. The only thing that's holding me up from assembling the engine right now is finishing up the shimming process, and I'm trying to find some shims. So that's that. Little things, and then my fuel rail, radium fuel rail, is also black. The fuel lines are steel braided, but one of them is going to go under the intake manifold runners, and the other one is going to go on the back side of the intake manifold down. So they are steel braided, but they're not going to be seen. And I guess since I'm talking about fuel lines, I'll continue on talking about the car. So my fuel hanger, I think, is Aerosport Engineering. So it's a triple fuel hanger, and that is 10 AN or 8 AN send and 6 AN return, which matches with the lines that I have. So yeah, so that's that. I haven't cut the lines or anything yet. They're still in the bag. I don't want to open it up and then risk them getting contaminated. I want to keep them clean and everything. And then more radium stuff. My fuel pressure damper and fuel pressure regulator are both radium because they bolt into the fuel rail really well. So I'm kind of excited about that. It's all black stuff. I think it's all black stuff. Black, and I think they're green. So that'll be one of the other little green things. So it'll be like a mostly black engine bay with little green accents and little purple accents. I think it'll look nice. I do. Like the radium stuff it's green, and that should match my timing belt cover and the coil cover, which will be on top of the head, obviously, because that's where those go. I don't know why I said that. That's kind of pointless. But hey, pointless stuff is fun to say, right? So another thing with the fuel lines going underneath the car, suspension. You'll see how these things tie in a second. So the car is too low as it is. Like I have it sitting on jack stands so that I could put boxes of stuff underneath the car. But my brake lines have actually been damaged on the car because I guess it bottomed out at some point, whether it's the previous owner or maybe it was me, because there was one point when I was driving, I hit a dip in the road that was it was an aggressive dip. And the whole bottom of the car just felt like it just slammed into the road. So it could have been me, but I did not like having the car this low. As soon as I got it, I think it's 2 inches lower than what it should be. So what I'm going to do to fix that is, one, I've got to fix the brake lines because the brake lines are smashed. They're not leaking, but they're smashed, and it's only a matter of time before they rust and then they start leaking. And since I have a Chase Bays ABS delete, brake booster delete kit that with a dual piston setup, that's going to be nice. That's actually going to be really nice. Whenever I'm installing that, I'll change out the brake lines that go to the rear. But also, I think there's a proportioning valve. I think there's a shut-off valve so that I could actually shut off the brakes to the rear. I don't know, actually. I'll have to look at that closely. It's still wrapped up because I'm just trying to keep it clean. But these are my spacers that I'll be putting on top of the rear suspension. So I'm not sure how much these are going to raise it up, but I'm hoping that they raise it up an inch because it's been lowered 2 inches. And this is sitting on coilovers, but the coilovers, they're not fully adjustable. They're only, you can only adjust the stiffness of the rear suspension and the front suspension. So I'm just going to use this to raise the ride height back up. If they're too thick, then these were cheap, and I'll just buy some thinner ones, or I don't know. I think they're steel. I'll have a friend of mine cut them in half or something. That might be something that I could do. Is just have them cut in half. That way I can adjust. That way I can have it set to the ride height that I want. But the front suspension I'm actually going to swap out to the factory IS300 suspension because I have that. So I'll throw those on, see how it looks. If it's too high in the front and too low in the back, then I'll probably just get spacers for the front, just like I'm doing for the rear. But the idea is it would give me a more cushy suspension in the front while also giving me stiff suspension in the rear. So on a hard launch, the back end of the car won't dip down, which it shouldn't because there's stiff suspension, but that'll give me a slightly higher ride height on the back along with that stiff suspension. And it will allow me to go over speed bumps without scraping and damaging the undercarriage of the car even more. I'm not gonna drive the car with it as low as it is after I put those steel braided lines in. I don't want the ride height of the car to damage the steel braided lines. Definitely not. Especially after, it would really suck, like replacing the brake lines and then bottoming out on the car again, and then like another, poor spot on the road, and then just damage the brake lines that I just replaced. Got to replace them again. So people that stance cars, I don't know how they deal with not getting a damaged undercarriage and then messing up, because there's a point where you're gonna mess up your fuel lines, your brake lines. That's just not. I don't understand. I don't know. I don't get it. This is the Chase Bays kit. So this is the dual piston brake booster delete and ABS delete. So there's my old ABS that's been relocated there. I have a video on that. It took forever for me to get this in the mail. I think it came in last week or the week before, but I'm glad I relocated my ABS when I did, because I had no idea it would take 6 months, I think, for that Chase Bays kit to come in the mail. I still have to dress up my wires. I'm not even going to open the door because it's insane. I've got to get some wire wrap and dress those up, because all the wires that I extended from the engine bay into the interior are all spread out on the floor. The wires need to be dressed up in here and the engine bay too, but I'm going to wait to do that after I get the engine in and in place, because I want to make it look neat. And if I have to extend wires, I don't want to have to cut into a wire loom that's now sealing up, or a wire sheath or whatever that's now sealing up everything. Because with the orientation of the new head on this engine, there are going to be things in different places. Most notably, the throttle position sensor and all the wires that went to the whole throttle body motor, and still running drive-by-wire. And speaking of, the 350Z and the G35 Infinity, 2003 to 2005, that pedal, the gas pedal, actually bolts in directly to the IS300. So I can go fully drive-by-wire and not have that ugly cable coming out of the firewall. I've already removed all that stuff and I've put it in place just to make sure that it does fit. And it does. It does fit. So now, I really, whenever I put the throttle body on the front, I find a good throttle body. I still want to go with the G35 throttle body because the diameter of it can still support the horsepower that I am trying to get. I just have to make it fit the front of my manifold. But yeah, a friend of mine with a CNC machine is probably going to make one up for me, but a little adapter. But yeah, that's a cool little addition, is the gas pedal, being able to use the G35 one in the IS300 and make it fully drive-by-wire and no ugly cable coming out into the engine bay. That's really cool. So I got a carbon fiber hood, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But the bumper, I was going to keep this bumper. This is an Altezza Gita bumper. And I don't know what specific type of, because there's a few different types of Altezza Gita bumpers, but this one I did like. And unfortunately, with the previous owner, he said after he had the car painted, he took the bumper off or something, and when he put it back on, he said it fell off and he kind of dragged it under the car. So it's very unfortunate because it's a beautiful bumper, but the whole bottom of it's missing because I think he's just cut that off because of how damaged it was. And the passenger side of it, is a section of it is destroyed and has been cut out. So there's also a big crack in it, and I've got to deal with that. So I bought this. This is a cheap, and I know there's issues with this that I'm going to have to address, but I'm prepared for those. So this is a knockoff TRD Neo V2 bumper, and it's fiber reinforced plastic, which is a little difficult to work with, but whatever. I like that it hugs the headlights really well. Then it's kind of shifted. It's not sitting perfectly on where it's going to sit, but it's shifted now. It hugs the headlights better than how it looks. But I bought these two 10-ounce tubes of JB Weld, actually 4 5-ounce tubes, but you mix 2 together and you make a 10-ounce. So I have the 2 10-ounce tubes of JB Weld, and I'm basically just going to mix it up and then dump it in the middle in the back side of this. And then once that solidifies, do the same thing to the other side, and then just start sanding until it goes, because I'm going to have to sand all the way down to the inside of this in order to make it, because this sticks so far out from the fender. I'm gonna have to sand all the way in to where the JB Weld is, and that JB Weld will add structural support to this little thing here on the side. And I would rather work with a JB Weld than a bunch of fiberglass and resin, and it's yeah. I'd rather do that. And then the mouth of it, where the intercooler is going to be sitting behind, that was another deciding factor of me getting this bumper versus fixing this one, because I doubt that intercooler, even though it's the smallest intercooler that I could find that is still rated at 800 horsepower, it's wider than most of them, and I think taller than, well, it's about the same height, but it's wider than most 800 horsepower intercoolers because it doesn't have the thickness. So from like left to right, it's wider, but the thickness is only about 3 inches. So it's still a slim intercooler, and yeah, that should fit behind the bumper really well and take up most of that mouth. I might have to cut the top part of that mouth off just to get a little bit more flow in. So that'll be cool. It'll be cool when that's in there. I'm probably going to paint just to see what it looks like. I'll just spray that little inside lip that's on the inside of the bumper. I'll probably just spray that white just to see what it looks like with the rest of the bumper black, and then the difference in color contrast should tell me what it looks like with that section of the bumper cut out, so I can decide whether or not I want to cut it out or leave it in. But that's the part of the bumper that holds the license plate. So that bumper is going to need some work. Walking over here to the hood. So I was going back and forth as to whether or not I wanted to get a carbon fiber hood with a vent, or whether or not I just wanted to get a carbon fiber hood in general. So my S2000, it had the same brand carbon fiber hood with, you know, same design and everything. And that was what the previous owner put on that. So I was just thinking like, well, I didn't mind that too much. I liked how it could vent out heat because that was a turbo S2000. I think I'm going to make this little panel, because there's a panel that is attached to the underside of this carbon fiber hood, and I can remove it, but it looks like I'm going to have to make it to where I can take it off and put it back on, so that, you know, like, oh, if it's a hot day and I'm going to be driving the car around a lot and I want the engine to cool off better, then I'll take that little block off thing out. Or if it's raining or something, I could put the little thing in, and so that it stays, so that the engine doesn't get rained on. But I just want it to stay pretty. But yeah, so that's that. And I think the hood's going to look nice on the car. It's my first time getting a new carbon fiber hood. All the carbon fiber stuff I've gotten has been secondhand because I didn't want to spend the money on it. I'd rather not spend money on some things, but this, I do like the idea of having the vents and keeping the engine cool. So what's cool though, I have officially got the cost of the car down to $0. So when I bought the car, I bought it for $3,000 as a factory manual with a slipping clutch, ton of oil leaks, and I think it died 3 times on me while I was driving home. Well, now I've sold the things off the car that I don't need anymore, and a bunch of the parts that came with the car. So the money that I got for the parts that I sold that came with the car, whether it was like the transmission or the head or like the AEM FIC6, those things that came with the car have been sold, and now the cost of the car is down to $0. So everything that's been put into it is the cost of the engine and the transmission and the build. So really I can add up the costs of all of that stuff that I've bought to go into it, and that's the cost of the car. And as it is right now, it's at about 15, probably closer to 16 grand. And the IS300s sell for that on island, even if they're not modified as much as this one is going to be. So I shouldn't have any trouble selling it if I were in a pinch, selling it and getting all the money back out of it that I've put into it. That's it though. I think I've talked about everything that I'm going to talk about. If you've watched this far, thank you. Stay tuned for the next video that will be on assembling the head and getting that all ready and good to go. I just need a few more shims so that I can finish that shimless buckets. But yeah, I need a few more of those so I can finish that. But anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and make sure you like, subscribe, comment, and God bless you guys.